Go.
Hi, this is Ron J. Jackson Jr., and we're watching the Break It Down show.
I love it. I love that I get to do this. And also, I love that I get to create conversations like this right here with my friend Don. Fellas, we're going to get into the book here in a second, but I think what is magic about this is Don has been on the show before. He's a Texas scholar in his own right. But Ron, you and your partner found this incredible story about the slave who survives the Alamo attack. And actually, Don's been on the show in the past to talk about the Alamo.
Right.
And Don has written a play on the character that you've written your book about. And so not only do you get the accolades for finding the story with your co-author and making this incredible thing, but now we're having this conversation. And you two don't know each other previously. Is that correct?
Oh, no, we haven't had the pleasure of meeting.
What a small world. So I want to ask Don. I'm going to start with Don. Hey, Don, did you see their book as part of your research for the play that you wrote?
Absolutely. Every bit of it.
What do you think of it?
I think it's great. I think they did some sleuth work that puts many an academic historian to shame. So I thought it was extraordinarily well done. I liked their conclusions. I liked some of the stuff that where they connected the genealogy and figured out, who this guy is and what he's doing, I think was just brilliant. It doesn't make sense. So often you have characters like Joe, an enslaved man who's marginalized just because of circumstances. And he's kind of a two-dimensional character. He was with Travis. Travis gets capped. Then Joe says, well, Travis got capped, and then done. We don't know where he came from. We don't know where he went. And that's what this book does. And it's a great gift to the literature, frankly. Sorry, I've got a man crush on this book.
Well, first of all, I appreciate that very much. That's high praise. Lee Spencer White, my co-author, and I, we spent 11 years across 5 states into old Mexico, gone down every rabbit hole we could to try to piece together this man's life. And a lot of times it was like chasing a ghost.
Sure.
And, Joe lived in, as Mr. Frazier said, in a shadow world. He was a slave. And so we had to follow the money. We had to take different avenues that you would if you were trying to track down a free person. And that would have been hard just following free people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So most of my background is in the Civil War that took place in Louisiana. I mean, battlefields, campaigns in Louisiana and Texas. So I'm very, very well versed in how you would traverse that terrain in the 1860s. So I was able to kind of project backwards when we're talking about his journey back to Travis's people. Right. And I was going, okay, I know exactly the road he would have taken. I know exactly where he would have laid up here and he would have laid up there. The great liberation that I had in writing a play is it's fiction. So my background is in academic history, and I've written a lot of books with a lot of footnotes and all that stuff. And if I sell 750 copies, man, that's a big win. But this writing a play built upon a lot of y'all's research that to make him a 3-dimensional character on a stage was y'all's work was a gift. And I was able to marry what y'all did with what I already knew about that terrain and those social settings. It was just a lot of fun to work with. And then the other part of the play deals with Susanna Dickinson and the interaction that, all we know about the Alamos from these two marginalized people.
Yeah. So. Yeah. As far as the play, I'm actually really thrilled that any attention that Joe gets, I think is of value. It adds more to the fuller story. It makes it a richer story. So I'm bravo to all that. I'm really excited about that.
Well, I hope y'all will be there. I'll make sure that there's tickets at will call.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that.
I sound like a producer now. I'm just a playwright, and I wrote the play. It's interesting. I was on a book tour with Phil Collins in the very early stages when he was donating his collection to the Alamo.
Right.
And I asked him how come he had never done Alamo the musical. And he goes, well, because I couldn't make Davy Crockett sing. And I'm going, oh, man, he'd have been the easiest guy to make sing.
Right.
But later on, I was up at a school up in the northern part of the state. And a buddy of mine was retiring. And his specialty was teaching playwriting. So I asked, I said, hey, can I take your advanced playwriting class? And he says, yeah, but you have to follow the syllabus. And I'm thinking to myself, well, how hard can it be? They're theater majors, right? Well, it turns out you have to write a full-length play in advanced playwriting. And in a whole full-length play is a page a minute, and a play is 2 hours long. So it's 120 pages I had to turn out that semester on top of my job.
Yeah, that's a lot.
And I was freaking out because I was thinking, wow, if I was writing a 120-page history piece, that'd be tough.
Yeah.
But I wanted to come up with an idea of an Alamo story that's not just about the Alamo. An Alamo story, it's about the people of the Alamo. And I was always fascinated by Joe and Susanna Dickinson being the messengers of the Alamo. So that's what I started writing on. And once I conjured the characters, they wrote the play.
Yeah.
I was merely channeling Joe and channeling Susanna. Channeling these people, but the only way I could do that is because y'all had done the heavy historical lifting. So thanks.
Well, I'm glad. Yeah, we all stand on the shoulders of other people before us, and Lee and I certainly are no exception. The origin story of Joe, I've actually had people wanting us to write a book on actually how we found him, because there was 11 years invested, and it all started from my fascination with Joe. Started the first time I read A Time to Stand by Walter Lord. And I had. I'd read about Joe, and of all the people there, I've been a journalist for 30 years. I was a journalist for 30 years. I was actually a sports writer at this time. But when I read that book, I thought of all the people I could interview, that's the one man I'd love to interview.
One guy,
yeah, the one guy that saw it, lived to see it, and then had a different perspective too.
Yeah,
he wasn't there by choice, and so I wrote an article on Blacks at the Alamo for True West magazine. And that was in 97 and came out in 98. And by December of 97, I'd already started researching Joe, and Lee and I were really close, still to this day are dear friends. She had an ancestor who died at the Alamo, Gordon C. Jennings.
Yeah.
And we wanted to, our initial idea was to try to find his family, because we knew somebody was out there somewhere, but we didn't know his last name. You could guess Travis, there were just all the hurdles that we had. But in the beginning, we thought this would be a victory if we could just, Lee and Ron go down the trail in a Jeep looking for Joe and piecing together his life. And the real, the moment where we kind of opened King Tut's tomb was when we found, we had traced him back to his second master, which turned out to be a second master, Isaac Mansfield, who died in Texas. And we found out that he was a tin manufacturer in St. Louis. So we went back to St. Louis, but now we had to find out, was he the original master or was there someone before that? And I came across an obscure book called Ain't But a Place. It was an anthology of early writings of St. Louis by African Americans. And in that anthology, I came across William Wells Brown, a little bit of his narrative that he had written after he escaped to freedom in Canada. And keep in mind, at this point, Lee and I already had the probate of Mansfield with the names of people we suspected were his relatives, Milford and his mother Elizabeth, and as I'm reading William Wells Brown's narrative, I come to a page where it says that he's talking about a sad time when his mother and his brothers were sold to Isaac Mansfield, and it was this aha moment.
Yeah.
And here's the beauty of it. This was the beauty of it, is all of a sudden the book totally exploded, because now we have a window into his childhood home in the Missouri Territory interior, in a place called Marthasville, which is it's on a bluff. It overlooks the Missouri River Valley. You could have seen herds of buffalo for miles. But he starts detailing all the things about his life and who his original master was, which is Dr. John Young. And at that point, the book the book became something very, very special, and so we were going to give it everything we had to make it everything that it could be, because we knew that would be, I mean, I say this with humility, but we knew that would be something very groundbreaking in the area of Alamo research.
Yeah, I agree. It was a great piece.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Pete's muted.
I got fat fingers. I love this story, and I'm into talking about it because I'm starting to do something similar myself. My first client is my dad, who's my biological dad, who I just met last year. But I told him, I said, I think I can interview dead people, and he's like, wow, okay, And I'm like if we did your dad, like my grandpa, who was a World War II pilot, who was in the Battle of the Pacific, all the Pacific battles, and you do have this ability to go back, and sure, this is 80 years ago that he was, that he was in World War II, and he was born basically 100 years ago. And you think, gosh, 100 years ago is a long time. But even the Battle of the Alamo, John Tyler was alive when that was going on. He had another 10 or so years to go. And he's got 2 grandkids, direct grandkids that are, I think it still might be 1 now, that are still alive. Like, this is not that long back. And so you can find these documents. And so I guess this is my long way of saying, I was going through the yearbooks that are saved in Ancestry, and there's all kinds of archives that people do things. And I'm like, I wonder if my grandpa will jump to, 'cause I'm trying to learn how to hear him, right? And so I'm flipping through the yearbooks. These are all digital, so I'm not really doing this, but I'm pushing a button. And all of a sudden, he signs this girl, random girl. He signs this girl's yearbook. And so 85 years later, my grandpa jumps to life, and it's just this phrase, but it's like, he was a kid. He's a popular kid. Someone asked him to sign her yearbook, and you have these moments.
A random girl either.
Right. And it wasn't the lady who was his, I don't think it could be, I don't believe, but it could be the lady who became my grandma, because they went to the same school. How crazy is that? Right. So you have these moments where these characters jump off the page and say, and no one's heard them for 100 years. Hey, here I am. And you found Joe. You're not supposed to find Joe. And I guess I want to ask both of you guys a question. So, Don, how rare is it to have someone jump back to life 150, 160, 180 years later like that for you? And what does that feel like? And then, Ron, when you saw that, what's your reaction? Is it dollar signs like, oh my God, we've got to smash it, we just turned this guy into a real person? How long was that high when you find him? Both of you guys talk about what it's like to discover those kinds of things.
Go ahead, Don.
Well, I'll start. Being a historian, people say, well, what do you do exactly? And I tell people that I read dead people's mail. So that's what I do for a living. And if you read enough dead people's, enough of their body of work, you start to understand what they're all about. And, history is by nature revisionist, because you're always going to find other stuff about that particular life.
Absolutely.
But, as a historian, you get to live multiple lives simultaneously. It's a great gift, but it also can make you a little schizophrenic, a little crazy. So I've spent most of my career writing about the Civil War in Louisiana, and there's several characters that come up. And so I can tell you a lot about these obscure characters like Nathaniel P. Banks or Tom Green or Alfred Mouton. And nobody cares. Ultimately, nobody cares. And people say, well, how do you have the brain power to do all that sort of in-depth research? And I tell them it's because I don't really follow Major League Baseball. If I did that, I'd have all those baseball stats in my brain instead of Civil War stuff. But you can resurrect them. It's a resurrection process, and they're leaving words out there for you. But, some people trashed all their personal papers. They didn't want people to meet them. They wanted to remain obscure. So whenever you have enough material to actually bring somebody back, or you're a diligent enough sleuth like you guys were, that you can bring this person back and put flesh and blood on them. It's like the old thing from Ezekiel, the valley of the dry bones. You see the bones come together, then the sinew, then the muscle, and they stand erect. And it's an army again. That's kind of what the process is like for me.
Yeah. I tell people, I do nonfiction narratives, nonfiction narratives, and I do heavily footnoted. And really, an analogy I use is finding an old portrait in an attic that's all smeared and dirty. And the more pieces you find, the cleaner the portrait becomes, and the more vibrant it becomes. You may not find all the pieces, you may not completely, clean it off, but you might find enough to expose this life. And I try to travel in the footsteps of all the people that I research, because places can often tell you a lot about a life.
Yes.
I mean, I've done, which, Pete, we'll talk about Fight to the Finish. I was about gentleman Jim Corbett and Joe Koinski. I went back to 1889 San Francisco to recreate that. In this book, we recreated, 1832 St. Louis, what that was like, and 1836 San Antonio de Bejar. And so it's really, somebody asked me about it. Why do I do nonfiction narratives? Why do I do history? I guess I like to time travel.
Yeah.
And, I like to time travel. And it is, as Don said, it's an adventure to go on. And right now I'm doing a book on a legendary bull rider, and I've been to Cody, Wyoming, and Tucson, Arizona, and I'm following the footsteps of this man. And just as we did with Joe, I mean, I sat on the banks of the Mississippi River. I sat in, up in Marthasville, where his childhood home, and all the places in between, Alabama, where I believe he's buried. It's just time travel. And in order to do that, the bounds that you have to work in when you're doing nonfiction, and Don knows this as well as anybody, you're restricted to those bounds. And with a slave, the restriction was even more, because you don't have a lot of primary sources. You hardly have any of his quotes, and they are taken from other people. So that's why there was so much research that was taken to try to bring that to life. But that's the best way I can explain it. And I'm passionate about it, and I love it.
One of the things that I've learned, so the next guest on the show on Thursday will be Chris Thomas King. He's probably the most notable blues musician who you can name. He's won multiple Grammys. He has written an incredible history of blues music. And one of the things that he claims in his history, and I want to get into the history aspect too, because Ron and I talked about this. He's like, hey, historians don't always like what I'm writing about because it kind of challenges the established narrative. And I knew that Don would be receptive to this. But before we get to that, Chris will say the blues were born in Louisiana, specifically in New Orleans, not in some field. He's like, in that time frame when they're claiming that the blues started, there were nothing but panthers and bears and mud out in that part of the Mississippi. He's like, this music was born here. And you think about like the reality, and this is where like you have to time travel. You think if you're in the Mississippi and you're bringing a load of whatever south, when you get to Louisiana and you get paid, you're going to want to go out and have a good time. And so where do? You go to these barrel houses, you go to these places where these piano players are having a good time, and you spend your money. And this is his claim. And he's got all this evidence to back it up. He's like, show me a playbill from 1890 that says blues show, and you're not going to find it. But you can find it in New Orleans. So there's these elements of defying what history is and considering other options. But there's also the rejection of your own things. Like, how do you sit on the corner of on the banks of the Mississippi and look out and think like someone who was a slave, or look at their life and see how impossible it is? But we all know life is just life. Like, this is the challenge. This is the thing. And I just keep going forward. And then the next thing you know, it's 80 years later and you're gone. So I guess, can you guys talk a little bit about the bias of history, our own personal bias, and then how do you truly become the person and fill those holes? Because a lot of these holes are like, what's a common day going to be like for Jim Corbett, the boxer? Like, he goes to the Olympic Club in San Francisco and whatever, right? You can kind of extrapolate these things. So talk a little bit about that time machine and what's in there, and then how do you clean it up?
Go ahead, Don.
Well, part of what you have to do is research deeply into a time and place. These people are all products of their time and place. And one of the things I think that is going on now is there's a little bit of dishonesty in the history space, where we're trying to take present day and project it backwards. And that's just a shortcut. And I think it's kind of intellectually lazy, frankly. You have to figure out what it was to be an enslaved man on the edge of the frontier, like you said about Joe. You have to understand, the frontier. You have to understand the entire economics and social fabric of slavery. the stigmas attached to it, the benefits or the people that benefited from that system. So you end up having to reconstruct the entire package instead of just saying, all right, we're going to focus on the enslaved part and leave everything else out. Any sort of historical deep dive takes a deep dive. I mean, you really have to study it up. Excellent historical fiction, historical nonfiction does that.
Yes,
that was the thing. That was the thing that was liberating about writing a play. Is the one thing that we always lack with history is dialogue.
Yeah.
You read a history book, there's no dialogue because we don't know that they said that. We can quote their writing, but we don't have it rolling out of their mouth. So the reason I went with a play that has Joe in it is because I can have Joe say things that would have been similar to what he might have actually said as part of the dialogue. Now, my history friends are all going to clutch their throat, grab their pearls, and roll around with their eyes, rolling around their head, saying, oh my gosh, you can't do that as a historian. And I have to remind them this is not history, this is fiction.
Right.
And where Joe can either be Joe, or Joe can represent a type, or Joe can represent a particular life in a particular circumstance in a particular time. But don't take this as history, take this as a story. And that's kind of that's my take on it, and my shift from nonfiction to fiction.
Right. Well, Don explained it very eloquently. The first thing I try to do when I'm dealing with subject matter is I try to take all the primary sources where I can put a person in a specific place in a specific time.
Yep.
And in Joe's case, that was really a handful of documents, a runaway ad, a mention in Travis's diary, just very, Lee and I didn't have a whole lot to work off of in that case. But like Don said, and this is very important, is that you're not only just following the person, you're following the places and time that in the setting. And the 101 in history is strip away your modern thinking and go transport yourself back to 1836 or 1832 or whatever your time period is for your subject. And I just soak in everything I can about the laws, other maybe oral histories that were left by other slaves in the same area. Anything that you can squeeze out of that to, there's no piece of evidence that's too small when you're doing history, because everyone adds up a little bit more and tells you a little bit more of a story and makes it richer. The book I'm doing right now is about a legendary bull rider who as a teenager used to ride the rails in the Great Depression. I don't have, other than his comment, I used to ride the rails and I rode them here and there. So I've dove into, books on people who lived that experience and talked about it, and it'll help me in the overall be able to enrich his story. And so, yeah, Don's correct. I mean, you have to strip away all the modern stuff and go back to a time and place and just literally transport yourself there to bring something to life.
There's an incredible story of Cabeza de Vaca. He kind of ran through Don's part of the world down there in Texas, naked, by the way. He and 3 other dudes, one of them is a slave, right? And so we know he's there because Cabeza de Vaca has to write for the king. That's why the record exists. And there's maybe some other things, but you can literally go grab the actual text depending on what library you're at. The Huntington Library is the closest place where they do this kind of research. And it is remarkable that a guy like Buddy Levy wrote this great story about the Kurluk, which was besettenized just after, like right around 1912, or right around the time of the Titanic, maybe it's 1915. But this is the ship that was actually built in Benicia in the bay right by where we're going to be talking about, Ron, and it gets crushed. You have everybody, they're scientists, they have all of their journals, and it's a remarkable thing to have like these required legal documents that inform what you're talking about. When you are filling in the holes, though, how much license did either of you take with what the day was like? Because look, a standard day is interesting to us now, right? But back then it was like, yeah, then I walked 42. Because you can look at a picture of it like an old West town and go, that's about 150 feet. So that's about, whatever. 75 paces, and then they make a left into the saloon. You can make these things happen by just looking at what's there. I guess I mean, maybe for you, Don, you can't. But how close do you get to fictionalizing what a day is as you're doing this, and what's too much fictionalization of that kind of environment?
Well, I would again, you can't make up dialogue. That's kind of hard and fast rule. So you use conditional language. If you just can't really pin it down, and remember, you're reading dead people's mail, you're looking at old photographs, you're looking at legal documents, everything that you mentioned. It's amazing what a receipt will tell you about everyday life. If there's a toothbrush on that receipt, you can assume that they're brushing their teeth. And so you put that in your narrative. This guy, got up, brushed his teeth. Down in the footnote says receipt, on such and such date for one toothbrush. So I don't think he was polishing his silver with it. He might have been. So I may be taking a little bit of license there by saying he's brushing his teeth, but it's pretty reasonable to assume. And ultimately, if he brushed his teeth or polished his silver, if that's not advancing your narrative or advancing your thesis, it doesn't really matter. It just adds texture. And it's forgivable texture in some cases if you guess one thing and it's actually something else. So, for instance, I was coaching a student that was doing a video for us, and she was talking about the woman who sewed the flag that was the first Texas flag, the Liberty or Death flag by Joanna Troutman. And her reward was a couple of pieces of silver from Santa Ana's camp. So she writes it into her script that it's 2 silver coins, but actually it was like a salt and pepper shaker from the silver set. So she had to figure out what, a couple of pieces of silver were. She went with the coins because that's what she was most comfortable with, most familiar with, but she couldn't exactly pin down the footnote. It turns out it's a different usage of silver. So there's always going to be a little bit of play in the line when you're doing history, but it's when you start making stuff up that historians start to cringe. Dialogue is the easiest thing to make up, and then making other general assumptions by projecting the present backwards is kind of another cardinal sin to me.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a follow-up on this because you read Lincoln, someone wrote down the Gettysburg Address, right?
Right.
And there was different skill sets back then. People would remember entire books of the Bible.
Yeah.
They would remember entire speeches because that's how they had to do it. And so they had developed these memories for this. But how much do you, and same thing for you too, Ron, how much do you trust these quoted passages from a newspaper or any kind of document where they're trying to quote somebody else?
Well, sometimes people lie.
Yeah.
They just flat lie. And so I've had people come at me saying, well, you wrote such and such in your book, and I know from doing a metal detector hunt that they weren't standing there, they were standing over there. Well, in the history business, you will put a footnote telling you where you got your sources. And my response is, you're not fighting with me, you're fighting with the guy who wrote the memoir that I quoted. So you need to hold a seance, resurrect him, and hash it out with him. All I'm doing is being a reporter. I've always argued that law, journalism, and history are the 3 almost intertwined disciplines in the way you go about thinking. And I've been a journalist, now I'm a historian, and I can tell you it's a similar sort of process. You let your sources do the speaking where you can.
Yeah, I mean, all I can really add to that is that, you try to analyze every source, you try to match them with other sources. And always keep in mind, I mean, it's the old say, if you have 3 people who see an accident, you may have 3 different perspectives. Doesn't mean that any of them are wrong, but they're looking at it from different, views. The Battle of the Alamo, the final assault, for instance, you had what is there from different accounts, the primary sources, they're in different parts of the compound. So it doesn't mean that any of them are wrong. It's just they may be looking at different perspectives. But ultimately, it's you as a historian to be the filter. And as Don said, footnote where you got your stuff from and try to do the best you can. You're always going to look at history through a blurry glass.
Right.
You're never going to have it perfect. my goal is to get it as close as possible. And because I do nonfiction narrative, I say this humbly, but I have to do a tremendous amount of research to bring something to life. And I wanted to just make a real quick point, on a certain day, if you don't have information, you don't have information. But, I can go into the weather on a day. If I've got a journal that says, man, it was, bitter cold on Thursday. And then another guy's talking about, yeah, it rained all afternoon. Well, now I know, and I can add that to my story. It may sound something little, but it does, again, it brings that story to life a little more. But, with Joe, that was a great challenge because, we had to be very careful about getting into his mind. But at the same time, we had done so much research on the world of slavery that, I walked out on that limb a little bit, but I still felt comfortable enough. And then, but it's like Don said, you have to draw a line on things. You can't. I wish I had dialogue like True Grit, but
Yeah.
but I don't. So
fill your hands, yeah.
Yeah.
So Anyway, so
I saw a recent documentary by the History Channel on Grant, and we're seeing this pivot to including the Black story into the history, but this comes at the expense. This is all appropriate. I'm not saying this is bad. This everybody can understand, but this comes at the expense of other aspects of the story that you might tell, right? So Don, you're writing your play, you have 120 minutes. That's a minute a dialogue. At some point, you have to leave out some aspect of what Congress did, and so now we're starting to say, and then this atrocity happened, and I'm bringing this into Joe now because Joe is a survivor, one of the very few survivors, and everything, he gets treated like a slave. So I guess a couple questions. How do you balance the direction that history is going to account for these other narratives that haven't made the cut in the past, while still telling a story that is true to the history? And then when you look at what was possible for Joe, like what we want to have happened was probably not possible back in that time. How much does that matter? How much does that inform what you guys are doing when you look at a story like Joe? Like, you want him to get like everything he deserves, but this is the early or the mid 1800s.
Well, I mean, I just, you go back to the beginning and you try to tell the story as honest as possible. Grassroots history, I'm talking women's history, African American history, which I love. I love grassroots. I'd rather talk about the scout that was with Custer than Custer. That's just that's my own personal thing. But if you really think about it, guys, and I know Don knows this for sure, but that really started in the 60s.
Yeah, you're right.
I mean, I was born in 1966, so it's a very small time. It's like you're saying, Pete, about how I interviewed a guy who was held by Geronimo as a baby.
Yeah.
So that times history shrinks, and if you really think about the 60s, we have a lot of catching up to do. And so it's not, we're not taking away history from anybody. We're adding to history. Right. And so when I do something on some type of grassroots history, whatever it may be, I'm just trying to add to the volume of history that we already have, and not take away from anything. That's just my humble opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. The only danger that I see in this process is we're knowing more and more about less and less. So, it's like doing a book project. You have to figure out what you're going to put in, what you're going to leave out. So in the grand historical narrative, I've reviewed textbooks, for instance, that have, say, 5 pages on the Haitian revolt that led to the rise of the first Black Republic in the Western Hemisphere. Okay. And then there's only a page on the Louisiana Purchase.
Yeah, which is huge.
So,
yeah,
the Haitian revolt is awesome. It's great. And I'm sure it empowers a new generation of students to see people that look like them doing great things. Got no problem with that. But in order to advance that larger narrative, you're going to have to spend some time talking about the Louisiana Purchase. And so that's always going to be the challenge. Recently, I was tasked here in the state of Texas to come up with a telling of the Texas story in a 13-page booklet. So 15,000 years in 13 pages. And I can assure you wasn't anybody happy. You know, hey, you didn't put this in there. You didn't put that in there. And so my response is, look, this is where the conversation starts. This is not the final word on it. And the good news is that path-breaking grassroots history that you're describing is being done. And I think if you start with kind of a central thread, you can branch off into these great stories that begin to tell even greater truths about the past and our collective journey. So there's just so much information.
I'd like to add a little something to that. I think the stage or the forum that you tell these stories is really important. So in other words, if I'm doing a textbook on the Texas Revolution, Joe might be a very small part of that. You know, my focus was Joe. So I dove into that within the context of his life and slavery and the Texas Revolution. But yeah, I agree with Don that you know, you have to, you can't shrink something like the Louisiana Purchase because you want to tell this other side really cool story. The side cool story should maybe be told in a you know, an article or a journal or something like that, or a book, which is fine. And all that adds to the volume of our knowledge, which is, you know, bless it all, you know, so.
Yeah, bless it all. And that's why I went with the stage play.
Yeah.
That way I could focus just on the human aspects. And every time I would go into politics or, you know, bring in Santa Anna doing this or, you know, some other character, I had producers that say, you're introducing too many characters. You're trying to write history instead of, you know, make this a good play. And that was a very useful exercise for me.
I'd like to add something to what he's doing. That you know, I'm not a fictional writer, but I have a great appreciation for fiction. And what his play is going to do is expose people to these historical figures that were real historical figures. And if you really think about it, I just speak for myself. I mean, the Alamo's been one of the great loves of my life. Not my only love, but it's one of my great loves historically. And it all started with a John Wayne movie when I was 11 on TV. And I knew at that time, even at that age, that, you know, it was fictional. It was Hollywood. And I always wanted to know what really happened. But the truth is that planted the seed of my lifelong love affair with the Alamo. So yeah, I mean, you know, fiction or nonfiction, if it gets somebody stoked about finding out, you know, knowledge, I'm all for that.
I want to spend a little bit longer on this history aspect that we're talking about now, because what you're saying, both of you guys are saying, is important. We often see this thing where I wasn't taught this in high school. You sure about that? Because, you know, especially you, Don, you know, like, hey, dummies, read this book, you know, and then that's the survey of the history. Right now, go read this book. There's a book behind me on. That's right. There it is. Right. Hey, I can't make my hand go the right direction. Right there.
Like back in a trailer. Yeah.
Yeah, that book right there is on MI5. To read that book and understand it, you have to read about 50 other books, which leads to the tertiary books to get it, right? So, yeah, you can go to Georgetown and get a lecture with that book as part of a series of books in that class. So you can be exposed to something. But when you're teaching high school kids things, you know, what you're really trying to plant is that seed that you're talking about, Ron. And even if the movie is poorly cast and unfairly unfair to other ethnicities, if you can plant that seed to go out and read it, and anybody who's complaining about like the presence of history can go out and they can buy your book, they can buy Don's book and go see Don's play. I mean, all these things are available. John Langelier, I don't know if you guys know him, but he's in Arizona. He does Old West stuff. He wrote this incredible story about Powhatan Clark and the Buffalo Soldiers who rode with him, and how it talked about how these guys were really like a special ops team, and it was primarily black dudes on that team. And here's this Southern landed gentry bigot who's like, I'm going to go out every day and put my life into these guys' hands, and I'm picking which guys I want because they're so incredible. We don't get to hear that history. You have to read the book. that he wrote, and that means you got to spend $20. And so if we really want to improve our history, we should all dig in. And I know, Don, you and I have talked about this. To know it, to contextualize it, to layer it, all of these things require quite a lot of work so that you can start to understand the context of the time, what it was like to be a slave in 1835.
Yeah.
Well, I had that same conversation with Phil Collins. And I said, how did you get interested in the Alamo? And he said, look, I was watching Fess Parker go down swinging on the Wonderful World of Disney. Yeah. So here's a kid who's 5 years old in Chiswick, England, outside of London. And his gateway was Disney. Yeah. And so any way that you can, for me, the gateway was the blue and gray playset, the Marx playset, Alamo playset, because Ron and I are in the same generation. We're senior scholars. But we all had these sorts of toys that put us in that sort of mindset. So I'm happy for whatever brings you into the conversation. I think I'm all for it. And increasingly, in what we're doing here at the Texas Centers, we're putting a lot of videos out there because the future's in video. And then you have to do, 5-minute video or it's too long, So it's a moving target, but we're trying to track it.
Yeah, even 5 minutes is like, that's a touch too long. We'll have to double the time on the playback. Now you got to account for double time playback and everything.
Yeah, else. Exactly.
Any thoughts on this, Ron?
No, I mean, well, as far as the future, I'm worried about people reading or not reading. That whole thing's going to change. Yeah, I've even thought about something like, when I dig into the archives, I'm sifting through old letters, like Don would say, or old documents and correspondence of future historians that I'm standing on their shoulders, and I kind of wonder, are people going to be able to read my Gmail? What's that going to look like?
Oh my gosh, please no.
Right. So
Gmail maybe, Yahoo doubtful.
I did a show at the World War I Museum in Kansas City, which, by the way, if you guys ever go to Kansas City, do not skip it. It's a fantastic museum. And when you talk to the scholars that work there, and I'm like, how much stuff is here? They're like, you can't even imagine, because families just send stuff all the time. And like you said earlier, Don, you can write the book, you can write the paper, but ain't nobody going to read it. And so you have these people that are just trying to parse what they can, which is a lot. But compared to all of the correspondence and artifacts from World War I, it's nothing. You can literally invent your own job and say, I'm going to be a World War I expert, and go out and start reading people's mail. And you put oh my gosh, it's an amazing thing if you have the passion for that. But gosh, it does seem like, and you said this earlier, Ron, you were talking about how like you always want the next thing. How do you stop and say, I know enough about this, I now have to go do something else? How do you wean yourself off of that incredible experience of reading people's mail?
You have to stay really focused, because you can end up going down rabbit holes that have nothing to do with your book, or very peripheral, in your focus. So that is a challenge, because those of us that love history we're going to be captivated by those stories. But I just try to really stay on task at hand. And it's a discipline you have to learn. It's hard to do sometimes, but and the other thing is the stories that I'm doing. What I'm trying to do is to advance history in some form, and dive into stories that I'm very passionate about. When I do a book, on average, it may take 3, 4, 5 years, with the research included. I've been doing 4 years of research on the bull rider that I'm writing about now, and I'm hoping to have that published later this year. That's going to be like almost 5 years of investment of my time. So when you dive into a project, it's like marrying somebody. You better be sure you want to be married to it. But all I'm trying to do is to advance it a little bit further. That's my hope. And do the best that I can with that. So that's all I really have to say on that one.
I want to, okay, so we haven't talked, and I don't want to get too much into the book because I want people to read it. Please buy this book. And here's what I always recommend. Here's the link right here. If you look in the comments on YouTube, you'll see it there. If you look in the show notes, wherever you're watching, you should be able to see the link in there. Buy two and buddy read. How great is that, right? And so support these guys because they do important work. Go see Don's play when it comes out. When you looked, I'm gonna ask Don this question. So you read Ron's book, right?
Yeah.
And you are an expert in the Alamo. What made your mouth open and go, "Oh my God, I had no idea," because you'd not seen this person's perspective before?
Daniel Boone. That's
Good answer.
Yeah, I was like, wow. Okay, because then all of a sudden, this is a real story with real connections. Otherwise, I mean, up to the point, anytime before this book, Joe is essentially beamed down from some sort of mysterious other world and plays this pivotal role and then gets beamed back up. He is some sort of extraterrestrial. He's not real. But all of a sudden, he has a genealogy, he has siblings. He has different places. And that's what just blew my mind. Look, we have a hard time telling the African-American story prior to emancipation, then even after, because their voices were not recorded. Same thing with the indigenous. If we're writing history about Indians, we're taking somebody else's word for it because they're a pre-literate or illiterate society. So when we can actually put that sort of texture into a life, that's when my jaw dropped. And it all started with Daniel Boone. And I was like, okay, this all makes perfect sense. So,
yeah. Joe, I've always described Joe as kind of a shooting star.
yeah.
He appears suddenly as a survivor of the Alamo. He's amazingly standing before the leaders of Texas at Washington on the Brazos, the men that just signed the Declaration of Independence for Texas, and he's given them a blow-by-blow account of what happened, and they're all just hanging on his words. In fact, one of them, William Fairfax Gray, made a remark about how remarkably Joe described things for kind of one of his kind. I'm paraphrasing it, but
Sure.
It's very powerful stuff. But what brought all that to life too, beyond just the Alamo, before where he came from and where he went, it really started with William Wells Brown being able to open that door to his childhood plantation. Mm-hmm. And somebody told me that, and I agree with the spirit of this comment. They said, boy, that's kind of like a 1 in a million shot, that the slave that you're doing a research on, you guys find a narrative from a brother. And I tell them, after all the research I've done, it ain't a 1 in a million shot. That's like a 1 in 10 million.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what are the odds? And so I felt, and I know Lee felt the same way. We felt a really, not that we didn't have this responsibility, but we really felt a big responsibility at that point to really see it through in the best possible way for history. You only get one shot.
That's right.
And then, Ron, how has Texas received your book?
I think pretty well. We had a great book launch. It reached several, the different Amazon category top 10 or top bestseller list. So it was really well received. I mean, lately there's all this discussion about slavery and all that kind of stuff, but I just stick to the facts and I tell people, and you can go to somebody like Thomas Jefferson, who had a whole, plantation of slaves and that sort of thing. I mean, one of the greatest minds in American history, I think. But you have to also view him in the context of a slaveholder. You can do the whole thing. A human life, you don't leave out the scars and the warts because you want to, because then it's not authentic. Then it's fake.
Right.
And I'm not, William Barrett Travis, who owned Joe at the end before he died at the Alamo, I don't think he's any less of a hero for what he did. I mean, I don't like the fact that he owned humans, but that's just part of his story. And you're doing a disservice to the man. You're doing a disservice to history. You're doing a disservice to the people that he encountered, the people he owned, by ignoring those things. So I think you can look at everything through a very honest lens. That's what I try to do anyway. So.
Do you ever think? Yeah, go ahead, Don.
I was going to ask Ron about this. So one of the things that I found to be both liberating and a challenge is giving Joe agency as a fictional character. What could he have aspired to? What were some of the pitfalls he would have had to avoid? What are some advantages he had for being essentially Travis's valet, his manservant? How did that equip him? What did he see his career as an enslaved man, but also an enslaved man with privileges because who's associated with? And then contrasting that to him essentially being auctioned after the will is probated.
Yeah.
And what an interesting compare and contrast that is. Rising star associated with a rising star, but always, in the shadow of that rising star, to just being thrown in with the general population on a cotton plantation in Brazoria.
Yeah. There's two things that come to mind. I mean, one, just let's talk about the Alamo for a second.
Yeah.
The men who died at the Alamo were heroes for what they were fighting for. And I've often defined Joe, and this is just my definition, but
sure.
I've thought a lot about this over the years, obviously, that I define Joe as an Alamo defender, but not in the same vein as a David Crockett or a Micajah Autry or somebody of that kind, or Jim Bowie.
Sure.
I see him as an Alamo defender defending his life and trying to survive and live the next day. And so to me, he's as much a hero, maybe even more than others there, because he wasn't there of his own will. But and then the other thing is it's hard for me to imagine that he went through the rest of his life kind of like, oh, that Alamo thing happened in, March 6th, 1836. I think that moment that he lived and he narrowly escaped, he was almost killed.
Yeah.
I think that forever, I can't see any other conclusion how that didn't forever define him as an Alamo survivor. There's an article that I found that Lee and I put in the book where he goes back to the Alamo years later. We've tried to narrow down the date. We can't find it. He's with James Travis, which was William Barrett Travis's youngest sibling. And James went around the country talking about his brother, his famous brother, and he was very proud of it. You can just tell by the quotes and everything, and the fact. And he made this pilgrimage back to San Antonio with Joe, who at that time is being called Ben. And I mean, that's a whole other story I could tell you about. But the fact is that he's there with James. And again, I kind of go back to that circumstantial, but I think he was very proud of that, to be able to stand there with his brother and say, this is where your brother fell and this is what happened. And I think he went through life as Joe, the Alamo survivor, and, unfortunately he wasn't able to do something different because of, a different time period. So
that made it into the play, I assure you. And the sleuth work where y'all uncovered the Ben story is great. So if you're curious on when he was at the Alamo, I will provide it in the play. Of course, it's completely made up. But I needed him to go back to the Alamo just as he did. Yeah, but I write really both of those. Yeah, I write both of those characters with a great deal of PTSD.
Yeah, I bet. By the way, if you guys are interested in go to see Don's play, it'll be in 2024 in the 8th and through 10th of March. That is the next scheduled showing. So you got some time to get ready to go out there. And where is it going to be performed, Don?
In San Antonio. So we're busy shopping a venue now. We're leaning heavily towards the Scottish Rite Cathedral, which is 2 blocks from the Alamo, and has a capacity for 2,000 seats. So we're going to have four showings and hopefully sell out every time. And
I'll be there.
That's good.
I'll be there.
I'd love to come do that. Yeah.
That'll be fun.
Ron, when you were sitting there and you're thinking about either the Travis family or the Joe family and you're time traveling, it would seem to me like one of the things I would think about is would I have owned a slave? Like if I had the means, would I have had the character to not do it, I don't know that I could. And it's not because I'm a bad person, but I'm not going to put myself above a Travis or anybody else who owns somebody, because it was a human condition back then. Do you ever struggle with that at all? I know I would, but I also wouldn't want to put myself above somebody else.
Well, I mean, I brought up Thomas Jefferson earlier. He's probably one of my favorite historical figures, and you can't help but tussle with that. I think he was the one that coined the phrase. When he's talking to somebody else, he said, "We've got the wolf by the ears," meaning we've got this issue of slavery. What do we do with it?
Yeah.
And he never did it in his lifetime. He never did anything with it. So I mean, he made his decision by indecision, but it's a tough thing to reconcile. I mean, and as far as like yourself, I mean, I don't want to be all high and mighty and say I wouldn't have, because I don't know how I would have been raised if I was raised in Charleston, and that was it's hard to reconcile where someone's been raised and grown up. I mean, thank God, this horrible institution of slavery is gone in the States anyway. But it's you got to have some understanding of maybe how you were raised. We were all raised in different ways and in different places, and by different people that had different value systems. And that's the best I can say on that. But,
Pete, if somebody gave you a liquor store, would you own the liquor store, even if you knew that liquor stores aid and abet alcoholism?
Yeah, I probably would. I'd probably give out free booze to people who I thought might come back.
That's right. So, I mean, that's part of it. I mean, would you own an SUV when you know that, that's probably not the best choice for the environment? We're all going to be judged sooner or later by future generations by what we're doing now. But we're doing the best with the knowledge that we have at our time and place. And sure, there was people back then that knew owning slaves was absolutely categorically wrong. And then their neighbor would say, well, over here in the book of, Deuteronomy, God ordains it. And they put their earlobe up against the doorpost and put an awl through it, and they volunteered to be a slave for life. So it's hard to crawl inside their brains like you suggest.
Yeah. One of the things I'm curious about, and maybe it's a question for either of you, but I think it's more on Don's thing. So I'm learning about Cabeza de Vaca and the work he had to do. One, because if you don't do the work and justify it to the king, he'll stretch your neck or chop it off or whatever. So you've got this life and death thing while you're in this life and death struggle. So that's how king fearing he is. But also, how could those four dudes who walk across Texas and Mexico and everywhere else and survive all of the things they survived, to include slavery, how do those guys not believe in God? I mean, they don't go so far as to say these are miracles, but these guys survived by being naked faith healers, blowing on people to heal them, right? Yeah. How in the world does Joe not go, there is a God? I mean, look, it's easy to look at someone who didn't die and be like, oh, they didn't die. I'm positive he carried that burden of like, well, because I know, like, look, I've been at a head-on collision with a tank. I'm never going to forget that. I've survived it, right? And so when you come to that close to death, when it's not up to him, it's up to somebody else. You have to, especially back then, you have to believe in a higher power. Like, how in the world did all this stuff happen, if not through some kind of divine hand? And so we don't have that need as much anymore now, right? But if you live Cabeza de Vaca's life, you're like, let me tell you something. There is a God.
Yeah, and I think the role of faith in propelling history is often overlooked. I think that if you're going to survive the lack of being able to determine your own destiny would lead you into the hands of God if you're part of the enslaved population. I think if you're Cabeza de Vaca, you've been having it drilled into your head to a great degree as a kid, and then all of a sudden you see it in action. I've always said that if the best thing that could happen to Christianity is if we started feeding Christians to the lions again, because then we'd quit, fighting with each other and say, oh, well, we're on the same team here, and this is actually going to, help us all have some sort of Christian unity or, pick a faith. When it's challenged, that's when your faith shows up. Yeah. And we've done such a great job in our modern lives to make things like adversity or risk or even death such a stranger to our thresholds that all of a sudden what need do we have
Mm.
for a belief system or an almighty?
Yeah.
And we've grown spiritually lazy because we've got it so good.
One of the things too, because it's so stable here in the U.S., when you go to a place like Iraq or Afghanistan, where the title of the religion is in the name of the country, at least it was the Afghanistan that we built, we don't understand, because we have a separation of church and state, and we have both simultaneously a freedom of and from religion. We don't get how important it is that in Afghanistan. One of the things I learned is if they have a meeting and they're going to make a big decision and we're not around, they have a holy man in the room.
You bet.
Because he has to validate that decision. So we can try to write that stuff out, but that's not the norm. People looked around and said they prayed and they tried to figure out why God cursed their crop or wherever it was, and they're like, how do I be better, or whatever it was. That's a real thing in history.
Yeah. If I could add something to what,
Please,
kind of off what Don was saying, I think all of us in our walk, we struggle with at different times. Something bad happens. It's like, why did this happen, God? Or and so you kind of struggle with that. And then I go back to slavery, and I'm thinking, boy, if there were ever a group of people that had a right to question things, it was probably them. But at the same time, that mustard seed, that just, it didn't take a lot of faith. A lot of them probably survived because of their faith in a higher power, and that probably got them through days. And but I think in some level we all walk that journey and ask those questions. If we lose a loved one or something like that, there's we all ask that question. I just think it might have been maybe a little more intensified for an enslaved people.
Sure.
Yeah. How do you get through, like, if all it is lost in the end, and you have to look forward to a whole bunch of manual labor the very next day, next minute, just to survive, right? Like, everybody has to work all the time. If there's not something, I was gonna say, if it's not something better, how do you continue, right? Like, how do you continue to go forward? What were you going to say, Ron?
No, I was just saying, how about having your kids sold off, or having your wife sold off? That's the part. I'm telling you, I'm not exaggerating. When I wrote passages in this book, I cried. I was that moved. But I also cried when Travis died, because I'd lived with him for 11 plus years. And so, but yeah, I mean, some of the stuff on the slave stuff, if it doesn't move you to tears, I don't think you're feeling.
Well, I got one last thing for you, Don. When you have the play and everything, so one of the things that must come out of this is that these actors who are really gifted, they must bring something to the character that you never even imagined. And would that inform your history? I mean, how they see their lives when they do their character work? There's probably some channeling that goes on or something.
It is, and it's magical. So we've done workshops where we've had staged readings, etc. So this will be the world debut next year in San Antonio. So in these staged readings, it's interesting how they take the words that came through my fingers and my word processor, and then put life into it, breathe that life into it. Yeah. And that process, them lending their humanity and mingling it with whatever humanity I brought to the writing and the thinking, and building upon Ron's work and Lee's work. And that magic is really tough. It's expensive to produce a play. It's a lot cheaper just to sit down and write a history book. So I can tell you that much. It's been an education. But when you start getting other people involved and it becomes an ensemble event, then for me, there's all of a sudden this new texture to history that is tough to have when it's just words on paper.
Yeah.
And even if it is fiction, you can all of a sudden kind of extrapolate. Well, it wasn't exactly like this, but I can see the roots of what it might have been.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Really.
Closing. Go ahead, Ron.
No, I was just saying, a play is a beautiful way to express humanity. I mean, it's a completely different form. It's like watching a movie. It's different than reading a book. And in some ways, a lot of ways, a book is different than the movie and that sort of thing. So it's all good. And I think there is something moving about seeing someone portraying somebody that you buy into, you believe into the story, and so that's exciting.
I want to wrap this up, so I'm going to have Don come on the screen. Don, any last words? Anything you want to say to Ron in appreciation for his book?
Thank you. I mean,
Appreciate it.
That's the most I can say. I mean, it was a great journey to take with you, and it was very inspiring. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing without what you guys did. I live just down the road from Lee Spencer White, and I've enjoyed my interactions with her. I've never met you, and I'm glad to see the other side of that writing team. But no, it was a great gift, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate your entire body of work. I mean, the way that you're approaching the past makes my job as a historian easier.
Oh,
Thank you.
So great.
Thank you. High praise. Appreciate it.
And I
will be there too.
Oh yeah, no,
I'll be there for the
that.
play.
Good.
And the thing I want to say is, how great is it that between my network, I'm able to bring Don into this thing with you, Ron, and it's like his play is informed by your book. That must blow your mind. So, what final thoughts do you have?
Well, I'm extremely humbled and honored that somebody would see value in that, and to the point to make a play. And I'm actually thrilled about that. So just very humbled and very thrilled. And I will definitely be sitting there watching the premiere if I can get a ticket.
We can make that happen.
Thank you.
All right, fellas, stand by. Let me wrap this up.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to.